I do think that it is correct to speak of a sort of stable human nature. So, for instance, we've discussed texts from various cultures. We've discussed Hesiod and his instructional wisdom. We are going to discuss this. We have discussed ancient China. We have discussed Musashi's Book of Five Rings. In a way, I think there are some differences that are a bit cultural, but the core seems to remain the same. And for instance, let me just say that Plato really loved the ancient Egyptians. He admired them a lot. And I think it is in the Timaeus or the Critias, one of those two dialogues, where he says basically that ancient Egyptians were notoriously wise. And in opposition to the Greeks who'll be forever children.
Well, it's interesting as well, because I remember reading about the accounts of Caesar going to Egypt for the first time, and he was sort of astounded by it, in a sense. Yeah. He had immense respect, from what I understand. Is that right, Beau? I might be misremembering.
Yeah, some. I mean, the thing that more springs to mind for me is Lycurgus or Solon, or is it both of them, supposed to have gone to Egypt and accrued vast amounts of
knowledge,
of wisdom and knowledge from the way the Egyptians, which is hundreds of years before Caesar. But yeah, was it Solon who went there? And
I think it was, because he left Athens after legislating, and
that's right. I think whether Lycurgus went or not is sort of much
debatable.
more lost in the midst of much more debatable. But yeah, of course, Egyptian civilization is so much older than the Greco-Roman world or the Hellenistic world. That is one thing to mention, I think. I always sort of say this whenever I talk about Egyptian history. We sort of have to make the point how much older it is, or how long the Egyptian civilization lasted. And it is of note, it is interesting that this is from quite early on, again, like the 5th dynasty. It's relatively early on.
Yeah.
But then, so the point you were making is that there are universal things, aren't there? So I think if you have any collective of people, any bigger than a few family groups, you're going to have certain rules or certain norms, should we say, for living. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Your civilization, your culture will not work if people don't respect each other on some level. Then you won't get anywhere. Let alone building whole cities, or whole strings of cities with a shared experience in some way. So no wonder there's similarities, very close similarities between ancient Chinese proverbs or morality writings and Hesiod and ancient Egypt, and they still apply today.
Yes.
No wonder. The idea that, just don't go around bullying all the other men in your community. Don't,
Well, there are sort of geographic factors that put the pressure on the Egyptians to form a civilization, in a sense, because of the nature of their agriculture, as in their sort of irrigation of the Nile and farming at the banks of the Nile in what amounts to a sort of very harsh desert around them, means that they are very dependent on one another, because of course you've got to sort out the farming situation, and if the farming doesn't go well, if people don't sort of hold up their end of the societal bargain, then a lot of people are going to suffer, because it's not like the crops fail, you can forage particularly easily in that environment otherwise. And I think that might speak to why there seems to always have been a certain amount of civilization in Egypt, or at least that's my kind of guess at it.
One thing to add here is Herodotus and his account in Histories of Ancient Egypt. I think the second book of the 9 books is about Egypt almost entirely. And he said that essentially a lot of things were transported into the Greek world from Egypt, ancient Egypt. And he says, for instance, that the ancient Egyptians were the first who believed in the immortality of the soul. I don't know if that is accurate or not, but it is quite something. And also, he says that the Greeks got the several gods of their pantheon from the Egyptians. I think he only says that Poseidon was taken from the Libyans, or the god of the sea. But there was an immense notion of gratitude and an immense notion of there being a kind of cultural debt from ancient Greeks to ancient Egyptians.
Definitely. And there's obviously more to it than that. There's sort of the Hittite people between them in Anatolia and things. But we talked about, I want to quickly mention, just in passing really, the Book of the Dead.
Yes.
Which again isn't necessarily, isn't a book as we know it. It's just a set of papyrus. And lasted for so many centuries that later versions are very different to the earliest versions. But the earliest versions, again, would have been taken from transcripts from, maybe the fifth dynasty onwards. And now, the Book of the Dead is a completely separate thing. It always gets described as sort of spells and magic, and it's specifically to do with the afterlife.
Yes.
So very different to this. It's very, very different. This is sort of how to live your life on Earth.
Yes.
So in a way, it couldn't be more different. Nonetheless, the point is that the Egyptian civilization, everything that came after them in that region of the world, does owe them a type of cultural debt.
Yes.
Absolutely. There's no way that just by sheer osmosis.
Yes.
Or we've mentioned Lycurgus and Solon, for example, great examples, that there's no way you couldn't have been influenced by Egypt.
I think trade was much more expanded before that. So a lot, for instance, again, Herodotus says that Hesiod and Homer were the first, in a sense, the first Greeks who brought the pantheon and gave them the gods' Greek names. And that was about, let's say, 8th century BC. Trade between civilizations was present centuries before that. So there must have been a sort of process of cultural osmosis, as you have said. And one other interesting thing to note is creation myths and also mythologies. We also have several patterns in mythology. For instance, in ancient Egypt, there was the myth of Osiris, and also the myth of the creation of the world, that bears several similarities with other creation myths. So again, there is the commonality, but also there is the idea that despite cultural influences and cultural debts, if you would like, there is also a strong case to be made that there is, as you have said, a stable human nature that sort of generates a kind of worldview. And in particular conditions, particular kinds of worldview become more prominent.
Two quick things to say is, there's so many examples of the same story being retold again and again, and it seems like the earliest version we're aware of comes from Egypt. The idea of Horus and a baby being sent down a stream, being abandoned and then found. I mean, there's Sargon and Moses and Romulus, and it goes on and on and on. But the other thing I would say is, you mentioned trade and the movement of peoples and ideas. The archaeology seems to show that before the Bronze Age collapse, which is 1700 odd, 1800 odd BC, the archaeology seems to show that before that there was all sorts of trade around Southern Europe and the Near East, the Levant, that way more than after, obviously, the Bronze Age collapse. So deep in the second millennia BC, it doesn't seem surprising at all that ideas could go from Egypt to Greece or the Balkans or
Mesopotamia.
From Mesopotamia to Italy. That's not crazy at all.
Isn't the sort of in favour theory of who the sea people were, that they were perhaps people from sort of Crete, which of course is a Greek island today, and perhaps some of maybe even the Italian islands. So that would indicate that there would be at least some connection, right?
Well, see one of my early epochs for a whole video about the sea peoples. We don't know. We don't know. Cole seems convinced they were Greeks or Hellenes of some type. It seems that they probably came from the north somewhere, whether that was Central Asia, Scythia, or whether it was more Europe, Central Europe, or what. We just don't know. My personal pet feeling is that it was more than one peoples. It was more than one wave of people, because the archaeology, even though it's very quick, still took decades, maybe 50 odd years. I think there's waves of sea peoples. Again, the Egyptians, actually, we've got some literary evidence from the Egyptians. At least 2 or 3 waves of people coming from probably Europe somewhere. But yeah, so to say they were just from Crete, I don't think that's sort of a bit too low resolution. But unfortunately, the answer is we just don't know exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the Egyptians seem to say the sea peoples were maybe as many as 6 different peoples. But anyway, the general point was that this actually is pre the Bronze Age collapse.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yes.
So it's sort of the old world, if you like, to borrow a phrase from Dan Carlin.
And it is written, let us move now forward to the text. I think it is written in a way that does suggest that what is going to be said is something that Ptahhotep said, but the person who writes seems to be different. Because it says, beginning of the maxims of good words spoken by the member of the elite and high official, God's father, beloved of the god, king's eldest natural son, overseer of the pyramid town and vizier, Ptahhotep, for instructing the ignorant in knowledge and in the correct method of perfect speech, which will be beneficial to the listener, but of no use to the neglectful. So I think this sort of answers who he's addressing. He is addressing essentially anyone who will listen. And this is also why it was used for people to learn how to write, for children to learn how to write, because they were told to essentially copy the texts and internalize the principles that they were being taught and asked to copy. He said to his son, this is the very beginning of the maxims, do not be arrogant about your knowledge. Consult with the ignorant and the wise alike. The limits of skill are never reached. There is no craftsman endowed with perfect mastery. Good speech is rarer than greenstone, yet it may be among women at the grindstone.
Greenstone meaning emeralds, meaning gems.
Yeah.
It's rare.
I thought it was iron for some reason, that had been oxidized or something. Or should
Bronze.
I say copper, bronze, yeah. What am I on about? Iron.
But still, yeah, the idea is that real wisdom or good, solid wisdom is actually quite rare. One very quick point before we go on, we were talking about how age, there's something sort of intrinsically valuable about age, and that you mentioned a caveat, which I just did want to, because just because the fact that you're in your 80s doesn't necessarily mean you know what you're talking about at all, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Someone can be old and still a complete moron.
Yes.
So, but nonetheless, nearly everything he does say in it does seem to ring true, doesn't it? So I feel like he was a wise person. When you read Hesiod, there's like bits of it where you're like, it's just nonsense, isn't it? To us, it just has no. It's just superstition based on nothing. Yeah. Whereas he keeps it very, very real,
down to earth.
Yeah. It's
110-year-old keeping it real.
4,000 years ago. Yeah. But well, sorry, I'll let you get into the individual examples.
By all means.
But it's most of it, nearly all of it, was my feeling anyway, is that it's difficult to argue with.
Yeah.
For example, listen to people that are considered wise as well as those that aren't.
I think that's very important.
Yeah, because quite often someone that is kind of not very knowledgeable, not very wise in sort of the classic sense, sometimes they'll still come out with something that's superb, that's a
Yep.
gem that they've figured out entirely for themselves. Never discount anyone, I think.
Mm.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.